The steady beeping of medical monitors filled room 407 of Boston General Hospital, where Margaret Thompson sat beside her husband of 50 years, Robert. Her weathered hands gently clasped his as she watched his chest rise and fall with each labored breath. At 72, Margaret still carried herself with grace, her silver hair neatly styled despite the long hours she'd spent in the uncomfortable hospital chair. Robert, once a towering figure at 6 feet 2 inches, now looked small against the stark white hospital sheets. Cancer had taken its toll over the past 8 months, reducing him to a shadow of his former self. Yet even now, Margaret saw glimpses of the handsome young man she'd fallen in love with at a summer carnival in 1973. Their life together had been what most would call perfect. A beautiful colonial house in the suburbs, 2 successful children, and enough money to live comfortably thanks to Robert's career as an investment banker. They traveled the world together, celebrated countless milestones, and built a life that their friends often envied. Mrs. Thompson, a young nurse, poked her head into the room. Dr. Martinez would like to speak with you about your husband's medication schedule. Margaret nodded, placing a gentle kiss on Robert's forehead before following the nurse out. As she walked down the sterile hospital corridor, her mind wandered to the pile of bills and paperwork waiting at home. Robert had always handled their finances, but with his illness, those responsibilities had fallen to her. Later that evening, after ensuring Robert was comfortable for the night, Margaret drove home to their empty house. The silence felt oppressive after so many years of Robert's presence filling every room. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea and settled at his desk in the study, preparing to sort through the mounting paperwork. Opening the worn leather wallet she brought home to pay some bills, Margaret noticed something unusual. Behind Robert's driver's license, partially hidden in a seldom-used compartment, was an aged envelope. The paper had yellowed with time, its edges soft from years of being carried. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she pulled out the letter. She'd never seen it before, despite their half-century of marriage. The date at the top caught her eye immediately, September 15, 1973, just 3 months after their wedding. As she began to read, her teacup grew cold, forgotten on the desk. The elegant handwriting belonged to a woman named Claire Bennett, and the contents of the letter would shatter everything Margaret thought she knew about her marriage. I understand your decision to stay with your wife, the letter read, but you should know that I'm keeping this baby. I don't expect anything from you, Robert, but I thought you deserved to know you're going to be a father. Margaret read the letter 3 times, her mind struggling to process its implications. The room seemed to spin around her as decades of memories suddenly took on new meaning. Robert's monthly business meetings that always seemed to fall on the same day, the separate bank account he'd insisted was for retirement planning, the mysterious phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room. She thought about their own children, Michael and Lisa, now grown with families of their own. Somewhere out there, they had a half-sibling they'd never known about, a sibling Robert had kept secret for 50 years. Outside, thunder rumbled as a spring storm approached. Margaret walked to the window, watching lightning illuminate the darkened street. She thought about the man lying in the hospital bed, the man she built her life around, the man she thought she knew better than anyone else in the world. Questions flooded her mind. Had he supported this child? Had he maintained contact? Was there an entire separate life he'd been living parallel to their own? The Robert she knew was honest, dependable, devoted, but this letter suggested a different man entirely. Margaret sank into Robert's leather chair, still holding the letter. Tomorrow, she would have to face him, knowing what she now knew. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to confront him about this explosive secret or let him keep it until the end. Tomorrow would change everything. But for now, she sat alone in the gathering darkness, listening to the rain begin to fall, wondering how well anyone can truly know the person they love most in the world. Morning arrived with a pale sun struggling through rain-washed windows. Margaret hadn't slept, her mind racing with questions about the letter she'd discovered. She'd spent hours searching through Robert's desk drawers, finding more evidence that painted a clearer picture of her husband's secret life. Hidden behind old tax records, she discovered a small wooden box containing decades of photographs. Each one showed a little girl growing into a woman, school pictures, graduation photos, and candid moments that spanned 30 years. On the back of each photo was a date and a simple name, Sarah. But it was the bank statements that truly made Margaret's hands shake. Every month since September 1973, a consistent amount had been transferred from their joint account to a separate one. The transfers had started at $200 monthly, increasing over the years to keep up with inflation. Robert had disguised these payments as investments, and Margaret had never questioned it, trusting him completely with their finances. At the hospital that morning, Margaret watched Robert sleeping peacefully, his face relaxed and unaware of the storm brewing inside her. A lifetime of memories played through her mind like an old film reel, but now each scene carried new meaning. She remembered a day in 1991 when Robert had missed their son Michael's championship baseball game, claiming an emergency business meeting. Had he been attending Sarah's high school graduation instead? The door opened quietly as Dr. Martinez entered for his morning rounds. "Mrs. Thompson, how are you holding up?" he asked kindly, checking Robert's vital signs. "As well as can be expected," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. She'd become good at maintaining appearances over the years, another skill she now realized she might have learned from Robert. After the doctor left, Margaret pulled out her phone and, with trembling fingers, typed Sarah Bennett Boston into a search engine. Several results appeared, but one caught her eye immediately. A Facebook profile showing a woman in her late 40s, with Robert's distinctive blue eyes and familiar smile. Sarah Bennett was a pediatrician at Massachusetts General Hospital, just 30 miles from their home. Her profile showed pictures of her with her husband and 2 children. Margaret stared at the faces of grandchildren she'd never known existed, seeing traces of Robert in their features. As she scrolled through Sarah's public photos, one image made her heart stop. It was from Michael and Jenny's wedding 15 years ago, a crowd shot of the reception. There, in the background, stood a woman Margaret vaguely remembered noticing, but had never spoken to. She'd assumed she was one of Jenny's relatives. Now she recognized her as a younger Sarah Bennett. Robert stirred in his hospital bed, drawing Margaret's attention. His eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on her face. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said weakly, reaching for her hand. Margaret took it, feeling the familiar warmth of his palm against hers. How many times had these hands held hers over their 50 years together? The same hands that had written checks to support another family, that had held another child, that had carefully constructed a wall of secrets between them. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice surprisingly normal. Years of love and trust battled with fresh pain and betrayal in her heart. "Better with you here," he smiled, unknowing that his carefully guarded secret had finally come to light. A nurse entered with Robert's morning medication, and Margaret watched as he swallowed the pills obediently. His cancer was advancing rapidly. The doctors had given him weeks, maybe days. The knowledge of his limited time made her hesitate. Should she confront him about Sarah? Did she have the right to disturb his final days with this revelation? But another question burned stronger. Did she have the right to let him go without acknowledging the truth? Without giving Sarah a chance to say goodbye to her father? Without allowing their children to know their half-sister? As Robert drifted back to sleep, Margaret made her decision. After 50 years of marriage, she deserved the truth. More importantly, there was a woman out there who deserved the chance to say goodbye to her father, even if he'd never fully been the father she deserved. Tomorrow, she would confront Robert about Sarah, but today, she needed to prepare herself for a conversation that would change not just their past, but whatever future they had left. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Robert's hospital room as Margaret gathered her courage. She'd spent the morning rehearsing this conversation in her mind, trying to find the right words to break 50 years of silence. "Robert," she said softly, placing the yellowed letter on his bedside table. "I think it's time we talk about Sarah." The effect of those words was immediate. Robert's pale face grew even whiter, and his heart monitor showed a sudden spike in his pulse. His blue eyes, clouded by medication, suddenly became sharp with recognition and fear. Where did you find that?" he whispered, his voice trembling as he stared at the letter as if it were a snake ready to strike. "In your wallet?" Margaret replied, keeping her voice steady. "I was paying bills last night and found it behind your driver's license." "Robert, I've spent the entire night looking through your desk. I know about the bank transfers. I've seen the pictures you kept hidden." Robert closed his eyes, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. The machines around him beat steadily, marking time in this moment that seemed frozen between their past and future. I never meant for you to find out, he said finally, his voice barely audible. I thought I could take this to my grave. Take it to your grave. Margaret's calm facade cracked slightly. What about Sarah? What about her right to have a father? What about our children's right to know their sister? Robert's hands clutched at the hospital blanket. I was young and stupid, he began. Claire and I, it was just a few weeks before our wedding. When she told me she was pregnant, I panicked. I had just married you, we were starting our life together. I convinced myself that if I just provided financial support, if I just checked in from a distance, I could keep both worlds separate. Margaret thought about all the Christmas mornings, family vacations, and birthday celebrations over the years. She imagined Sarah experiencing these moments without her father, receiving only checks in the mail as proof of his existence. Did you ever spend time with her? Margaret asked, dreading the answer. Robert nodded slowly. Those business meetings, some of them were to see her. School plays, graduations, big moments. I was never really her father, just a shadow in the background. Claire remarried when Sarah was 5, and her stepfather raised her. He was her real dad in all the ways that matter. Except that she's your daughter, Robert, Margaret said firmly. She has your eyes, your smile. I saw her at Michael's wedding. She was there, wasn't she? Watching from a distance, just like you've done her entire life. Robert's monitor showed another spike in his heart rate. She asked to come, he admitted. She wanted to see her siblings, even if she couldn't meet them. I shouldn't have allowed it, but I couldn't say no. It was the only time she'd ever asked me for anything. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, needing a moment to compose herself. Outside, life continued normally. Doctors hurrying across the parking lot, families walking in and out of the hospital, all unaware of the decades of secrets unraveling in room 407. Sarah is a pediatrician now, Margaret said, turning back to face her husband. Did you know that? She has 2 children of her own. Our grandchildren, Robert. Michael and Lisa's niece and nephew. Please, Robert begged, reaching for her hand. Please don't tell them. Let me die with them remembering me as I was. Margaret pulled her hand away. As you were? A man who lied to his wife for 50 years? A father who denied his daughter and robbed his children of knowing their sister? Is that really how you want to be remembered? The weight of his choices seemed to physically press Robert into his hospital bed. The machines continued their steady rhythm, marking each moment of truth between them. What are you going to do? He asked finally, his voice small and afraid. Margaret picked up her purse and took out her phone, pulling up Sarah's Facebook profile. She turned the screen toward Robert, showing him his daughter's smiling face. I'm going to do what you should have done 50 years ago, she said firmly. I'm going to reach out to Sarah, and then, Robert, you're going to finally be honest with our children. All of our children. Robert closed his eyes again, but Margaret had already seen the mixture of relief and terror in them. After 50 years, his carefully constructed walls were finally crumbling, and neither of them knew what would remain standing when the dust settled. Margaret sat in the hospital cafeteria, her coffee growing cold as she watched the entrance. She'd sent Sarah Bennett a carefully worded message through Facebook 2 days ago, and after several exchanges, they had agreed to meet here. The message had been simple. Dear Dr. Bennett, my name is Margaret Thompson. I'm Robert Thompson's wife, and I recently discovered something that concerns both of us. Would you be willing to meet? The clock showed 2:55 p.m. Sarah had agreed to come at 3 o'clock. Margaret's heart pounded as she thought about meeting her husband's secret daughter for the first time. At least, the first time with full awareness of who she was. At exactly 3 o'clock p.m., a woman walked into the cafeteria. Margaret recognized her immediately from the photos, but seeing her in person was different. Sarah had Robert's height and bearing, his way of scanning a room, and those unmistakable blue eyes. She wore scrubs under her white doctor's coat, with a stethoscope around her neck. Their eyes met across the room, and Sarah walked over slowly, her face a mixture of uncertainty and determination. Mrs. Thompson? She asked softly, standing by the table. Please call me Margaret, she replied, gesturing to the empty chair. Thank you for coming, Sarah. Sarah sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I was surprised to get your message, she said. After all these years, I assumed you didn't know about me. I didn't, Margaret confirmed, her voice steady despite her emotions. I found out 3 days ago. A letter from your mother to Robert, dated 1973. Sarah nodded slowly. Mom told me the whole story when I was 16. About the affair, about Robert's decision to keep me a secret. She never tried to make him sound like a villain, just a young man who made a choice he couldn't undo. Margaret studied the woman before her, seeing traces of both Robert and Claire in her features. Did you want more from him? All those years? Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. Sometimes, watching from the sidelines was difficult. Seeing my half-siblings growing up, having a real relationship with him. But Tom, my stepdad, he was wonderful. He adopted me when I was 5, gave me his name, loved me like his own. But you kept track of the family, Margaret said gently. You were at Michael's wedding. A flush spread across Sarah's cheeks. I shouldn't have gone. It was selfish. But I just had my first child, and something about becoming a parent myself made me want to see them. Robert arranged it so I could attend as a distant cousin of the bride's family. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out one of the photos she'd found in Robert's box. It showed Sarah at her medical school graduation, beaming in her cap and gown. He kept pictures of you, every major moment of your life. Sarah's hand trembled as she took the photo. He was there that day, standing at the back of the auditorium. He sent me flowers with no card, just like he did for my high school graduation, my wedding. Her voice trailed off. Robert is dying, Margaret said quietly. The doctors give him weeks at most. That's why I reached out. I thought you should have the chance to say goodbye, if you want to. Sarah's professional composure cracked slightly. I know, I've been following his case. One advantage of working in this hospital, I could check his records. I've walked past his room a dozen times, but I've never gone in. Would you like to? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah stared at her own hands, now twisting nervously in her lap. What about Michael and Lisa? I don't want to disrupt their time with him. They don't know yet, Margaret admitted. But they will. Robert agreed to tell them tomorrow. After that, it's up to you what kind of relationship you want with your siblings, if any. Sarah looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. Why are you doing this? You could have kept the secret, let it die with him. Instead, you're upending everyone's lives, including your own. Margaret reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. It was warm and slightly calloused, a doctor's hands, used to helping others. Because 50 years of lies is enough. Because you deserve the truth. Because Michael and Lisa deserve to know their sister. And because maybe, just maybe, there's time to heal some of what's been broken. Sarah squeezed her hand back, and for a moment, they sat in understanding silence. Two women connected by one man's choices, finally facing the truth together. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Margaret had arranged for Michael and Lisa to come to the hospital early, telling them only that their father had something important to share. They arrived together, sharing concerned looks as they entered Robert's room. Michael, now 45, was a mirror image of his father in his younger days. Lisa, 42, carried herself with her mother's grace. They found their father propped up in bed, looking more alert than he had in days, though the effort clearly cost him. Dad, what's going on? Lisa asked, taking her usual seat beside the bed. Mom said it was urgent. Robert looked at Margaret, who stood by the window, before turning back to his children. There's something I need to tell you both. Something I should have told you long ago. Michael leaned forward, frowning. Dad, whatever it is, it can wait until you're stronger. No, Robert said firmly. It's waited too long already. He took a shaky breath. You have a sister, an older sister named Sarah. The silence that followed was deafening. Lisa's hand flew to her mouth, while Michael stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. What are you talking about? Michael demanded. Is this the medication talking? Margaret stepped forward. It's true. Sarah was born in 1974, just before you, Michael. She's your father's daughter from a brief relationship he had before our marriage. Lisa turned to her mother, eyes wide with shock. You knew about this? I just found out 3 days ago, Margaret replied quietly. I found a letter, and then other evidence. Sarah is real. She's a doctor, right here in this hospital. Michael paced the small room, running his hands through his hair. A doctor in this hospital? So she's been here, all this time, and you never told us. Robert's voice cracked as he spoke. I sent her money every month. Watched her grow up from a distance. I thought I was protecting our family. Protecting us? Lisa's voice rose. From what? From knowing we had a sister. From having a relationship with her? How could you do this to us? To her? I was a coward, Robert admitted, tears rolling down his cheeks. I made a choice when I was young, and then I kept making the same choice every day for 50 years. I told myself it was better this way, but I was wrong. Michael stopped pacing and faced his father. Was she at my wedding? The woman who looked like you. The one who left early? Robert nodded slowly. She wanted to see her siblings, just once. She's never asked for anything else. Have you met her? Lisa asked Margaret. Yesterday, Margaret replied. She's a lovely woman. She has 2 children, your niece and nephew. She looks so much like your father. Michael sank back into his chair, his anger deflating into sadness. All these years, all the family gatherings, holidays, birthdays, she was out there alone. Not alone, Robert corrected weakly. She had her mother and a good stepfather who raised her as his own. She's had a good life. But she didn't have us, Lisa whispered. And we didn't have her. The room fell silent again, each person lost in their own thoughts, their own recalculation of their family history. The steady beeping of monitors marked time as they processed this life-changing revelation. Finally, Margaret spoke. Sarah knows you're being told today. She's willing to meet you both, if you want. She understands if you don't. Michael and Lisa exchanged looks, decades of sibling communication passing between them silently. Of course we want to meet her, Lisa said firmly. She's our sister. Now, Michael added. We want to meet her now, before. He glanced at his father's frail form, leaving the sentence unfinished. Robert closed his eyes, relief and regret washing over his face. She's a pediatrician on the 4th floor, he said softly. She has your eyes, Michael, and your laugh, Lisa. Margaret picked up her phone. I'll text her. She's been waiting to hear from us. As Margaret typed the message, she watched her children move closer to each other, instinctively seeking comfort in their shared shock and confusion. Robert watched them too, his face showing the weight of his long-kept secret finally lifting, even as the consequences of his choices began to unfold. 20 minutes after Margaret's text, there was a soft knock on the hospital room door. The atmosphere inside was charged with tension and anticipation. Michael and Lisa stood together near their father's bed, while Margaret remained by the window, giving them space for this moment. Sarah entered slowly, still wearing her white doctor's coat. She had taken off her stethoscope, but her hospital ID badge was visible, reading Dr. Sarah Bennett, Pediatrics. She looked as nervous as everyone else felt. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The siblings stared at each other, taking in features they shared, seeing their father's characteristics reflected in a new face. Michael was the first to move, taking a step forward with his hand extended. I'm Michael, he said, his voice rough with emotion, though I guess you already knew that. Sarah took his hand, tears forming in her eyes. Yes, I've known about you both for so long. I was at your wedding. I'm sorry if that was wrong. Lisa moved forward then, bypassing the handshake entirely, then pulling Sarah into a tight hug. Don't apologize, she said firmly. You're our sister. You've had every right to be there. Sarah broke down then, returning Lisa's hug while reaching out to include Michael. The 3 siblings stood embracing, years of separation dissolving in their first shared moment. From his bed, Robert watched his children together for the first time, his face a mixture of joy and deep regret. Margaret noticed his heart monitor showing elevated readings and moved closer to check on him. When the siblings finally separated, Sarah wiped her eyes and pulled out her phone. Would you like to see your niece and nephew? She asked hesitantly. Emma is 12, and Jack is 9. Michael and Lisa crowded around the phone, examining photos of children who shared their blood. They look just like you, Lisa said, then corrected herself with a glance at their father. Like us. They look like us. Emma plays soccer, Sarah said, scrolling through pictures. And Jack is learning piano. They're good kids. I told them about you, in a way, that they have an uncle and aunt they haven't met yet. We'd love to meet them, Michael said quickly, if you're comfortable with that. My kids too. You have 2 more nephews, and Lisa's daughter. Grace, Sarah finished softly. I know her name is Grace. I've seen pictures on Facebook. The reality of how much Sarah knew about them, while they knew nothing about her, hit Michael and Lisa hard. They shared another look, communicating silently as only siblings can. Tell us everything, Lisa said, pulling chairs closer to form a circle. Tell us about your life, about growing up, about your family. We have so much catching up to do. Sarah sat down, glancing at Robert before beginning. Well, I grew up in Worcester, about an hour from here. My mom married Tom Bennett when I was 5, and he adopted me officially. He's been an amazing father, but I always knew about Robert, about Dad. Mom never kept it a secret from me. As Sarah spoke, Margaret watched her husband. Robert's eyes never left his children, drinking in the sight of them together, perhaps imagining all the moments like this that could have been. I decided to become a doctor because of Tom. Actually, Sarah continued. He had a heart condition when I was young, and his doctors saved his life. I wanted to do that for other families. Just like Dad wanted Michael to take over his business, Lisa observed. He always said the helping professions ran in our blood. I guess he was more right than we knew. The conversation flowed naturally, years of stored-up questions and stories pouring out. They talked about shared traits they never knew they had, the same allergies, the same habit of humming while concentrating, the same terrible handwriting. Robert mostly stayed quiet, conserving his strength, but his eyes shone as he watched his children together. At one point, Margaret caught him mouthing the words "thank you" to her. She nodded slightly, understanding that despite the pain this truth had caused, bringing his children together before it was too late was the right thing to do. As morning turned to afternoon, the siblings continued talking, making plans to introduce their children, to have family dinners, to build the relationships they should have had all along. In that hospital room, surrounded by the beeping of monitors and the smell of disinfectant, a new chapter of their family's story was beginning. Over the next week, Robert's condition deteriorated rapidly. The cancer was spreading faster than the doctors had anticipated, but these final days brought something unexpected, healing of a different kind. The hospital room that had once felt cold and sterile was now filled with life. Sarah's children met their cousins for the first time, their childish laughter echoing through the corridors. Emma and Jack were instantly accepted by their new cousins, and together they created artwork to decorate their grandfather's room. Tom Bennett, Sarah's stepfather, even came to visit. The meeting between the two fathers, the one who had given Sarah life and the one who had given her a life, was awkward at first, but ended in a long handshake and quiet words of gratitude from Robert. You did what I couldn't, Robert told Tom, his voice weak but clear. You gave her the father she deserved. Sarah split her time between her duties as a doctor and visiting her father's room. Sometimes she would come in during her breaks, still in her scrubs, just to sit quietly beside him. Other times, she would join her siblings as they shared stories, filling in the gaps of their separate lives. Margaret watched it all with mixed emotions. The joy of seeing her family whole was tempered by the knowledge that it had taken Robert's impending death to make it happen. She noticed how Sarah would sometimes catch herself before calling Robert Dad, how Michael and Lisa were still processing their complicated feelings about their father's deception. One evening, when Robert was having a particularly good day, he asked to speak to all his children alone. Margaret stepped out, but through the window, she could see them gathered around his bed, Michael on one side, Lisa and Sarah on the other. I've been a coward most of my life, Robert told them, his voice barely above a whisper. I convinced myself I was protecting everyone, but really, I was just protecting myself. Sarah, I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved. Michael, Lisa, I'm sorry I kept you from knowing your sister. I can't change the past, but seeing you all together now, it's more than I deserve. Sarah reached for his hand, finally allowing herself to call him what she wanted to for years. Dad, I forgive you. Mom always told me that people can make mistakes and still be good people. You gave me life, you made sure I was taken care of, and now you've given me a brother and sister. That's not nothing. Michael cleared his throat, fighting back tears. I'm still angry about the lies, Dad, but I'm grateful to have Sarah in our lives now. We'll make it right going forward. Lisa, always the most emotional of the three, was crying openly. We're all together now. That's what matters. Later that night, as Margaret sat in her usual chair beside Robert's bed, he turned to her with tired eyes. Thank you, he said softly, for being braver than I ever was, for doing what I should have done years ago. I did it for all of us, Margaret replied, taking his hand. Including you, Robert. You needed to make peace with this before. She couldn't finish the sentence. Before I die, he completed for her. It's okay to say it. I'm ready now. Seeing them together, seeing them bond. I can go knowing they'll take care of each other. 3 days later, Robert's breathing became more labored. The doctors increased his pain medication, and the family took turns sitting with him. It was during Sarah's shift, as she was checking his vital signs both as a daughter and a doctor, that Robert opened his eyes one last time. Sarah, he whispered, squeezing her hand weakly. I always loved you. Always watched over you. I was just too weak to show it. Sarah pressed a kiss to his forehead, her tears falling onto his face. I know, Dad, I know. Michael and Lisa rushed in, having been called by Margaret. The four of them stood together as Robert took his last breaths, his children united around him at last. Margaret held his other hand, watching as 50 years of secrets and regret seemed to lift from his face, leaving behind a peaceful expression she hadn't seen in years. Robert Thompson died at 9:47 p.m., surrounded by all of his children, his wife, and the knowledge that his family would continue on, stronger together than they had ever been apart. 1 year after Robert's passing, the Thompson family gathered at Margaret's house for Sunday dinner. The dining room table that had once seated 4 now accommodated 11. Margaret, her 3 children and their spouses, and all 5 grandchildren. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the house, making it feel alive again. Sarah's children, Emma and Jack, were no longer the new cousins but simply part of the family. They played video games with Michael's boys in the living room, while Lisa's daughter Grace taught Emma her latest ballet moves. The adults gathered in the kitchen, sharing stories and helping Margaret prepare dinner. Mom, let me help with that, Sarah said, taking the heavy casserole dish from Margaret's hands. Over the past year, their relationship had grown into something unique. Not quite mother and daughter, but more than friends. They shared a bond forged through their common experience of loving and forgiving Robert. Did you bring the photo albums? Lisa asked Sarah as they set the table together. After Robert's death, they had discovered more boxes of photographs in his office, a lifetime of moments captured from afar. Sarah had been collecting them, along with her own family photos, to create a complete family history. They're in my car, Sarah replied. I thought we could look at them after dinner. I found some amazing pictures of Dad from his college years. Michael, overhearing their conversation, joined them. Speaking of Dad, did you tell Mom about your decision? Sarah nodded, turning to Margaret. We've been talking about it for a while now. I'm going to legally change my last name to Thompson Bennett, keep both parts of who I am. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. Robert would have been so proud, she said softly. He'd be proud of all of you, of how you've handled everything. The past year hadn't been easy. There had been difficult conversations, moments of anger and grief, times when the weight of 50 years of secrets threatened to overwhelm them. But there had also been healing, understanding, and the joy of discovering new connections. Tom Bennett, Sarah's stepfather, had become a welcome addition to family gatherings, bringing his own wisdom and love to the expanded family. He and Margaret had developed a friendship based on their shared experience of loving their children through complicated circumstances. Dinner's ready, Margaret called out, and the sound of running feet filled the house as the grandchildren raced to the table. As everyone settled into their seats, Margaret looked around at the faces of her family, the family that Robert's secret had kept apart for so long, but that truth had finally brought together. Sarah raised her glass. I'd like to make a toast, she said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that Robert's once had, to Dad, who gave us each other, even if it took us a while to find our way, and to Mom, she smiled at Margaret, who had the courage to help us find each other. To family, Michael added, lifting his glass. To truth, Lisa joined in. To new beginnings, Margaret finished, her heart full. After dinner, as the children played in the backyard and the adults gathered around the photo albums, Margaret slipped away to Robert's study. She kept it mostly unchanged, finding comfort in the familiar surroundings. On his desk sat a new photo, taken at last year's Christmas gathering, showing all 3 siblings with their children, Margaret in the center, and Tom Bennett standing proudly with them. She picked up the photo, running her fingers over the smiling faces. "You see, Robert," she whispered, "love multiplies, it doesn't divide. Our family didn't break when the truth came out. It grew stronger." From downstairs came the sound of laughter and friendly argument as the siblings discovered another old photograph, another shared story. Margaret smiled, knowing that while Robert's secret had caused pain, its revelation had ultimately brought healing. Their family story hadn't ended with Robert's death. It had simply begun a new chapter, one written in truth, forgiveness, and love. She placed the photo back on the desk and headed downstairs to rejoin her family, leaving the past where it belonged and stepping forward into their future together.